The following conversation is with Ivan Lee, CEO and founder of Datasaur, a natural language processing based startup in the AI space. I've known Ivan for a couple of years since he was working at Yahoo, but it's not his first rodeo as a startup founder. He initially founded a gaming startup, joined Yahoo, joined Apple, learned how to become a very successful product manager before venturing out again to work on his own startup. This was a really fun conversation filled with a lot of learnings and career insights. We also get into the personal side of Ivan and what motivates him, the why behind why he does what he does today. Also, a little bit of chat on where the future of technology is going, with particular to generative AI, things like ChatGPT, and how it's going to transform our society as a whole. A very candid conversation. Ivan was great for answering every question I threw at him. And whether you're a startup founder, a product manager, or just someone who has some interest in the tech space, I think this is going to be a fun conversation to follow along to. Enjoy. Who is Ivan Lee?
All right. So my name is Ivan. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Datasaur.ai. I started off by studying computer science at Stanford University, finished my bachelor's, dropped out of my master's there, and my first job out of school was to start a gaming company. I've been a lifelong gamer. It was always my dream to build and design my own game. And so my friends and I did that for a summer. We loved it so much, didn't quite get to all the finishing touches we wanted to put on it, so we continued with it. And we kind of stumbled our way into founding our own startup here. We created this company called Loki Studios. We built a location-based Pokemon Go style game back in 2010. And it was a ton of fun. We got to design and create a whole cast of creatures, created the whole universe. It was early for its time, but we were able to get to 1 million users. We built a profitable game and ultimately sold that company to Yahoo in 2013. From there, I was offered the position of engineering manager, but realized that what I had done in that startup as founder and CEO was essentially closer to product management. And so I asked to be placed as a product manager instead. I ended up working at Yahoo for a couple of years, went through their newly formulated APM program. And so that was a pivotal turning point in my career. I was given the opportunity to work as an APM, which basically serves as a paid 2-year MBA for product management. They put us through this whole training curriculum. We got to travel internationally, meet the head of legal, meet the head of marketing, sales, finance, just learn from all the leads in these different departments and understand what product management is like at a large company. It was modeled very closely after Marissa Mayer's program at Google. From there, I went to lead product at a Series A startup out in New York for a little bit, returned to the Bay Area to work at Apple, where I led some of their machine learning projects. And then I left Apple after 2 years to found Datasaur.ai. And so I guess what I want to highlight there is I've been through it all. I've been through early stage startups, middle stage startups, 10,000 plus person companies. And I've seen what product management looks like across all these different types of organizations.
Excellent. And yes, now the memory's coming back. Obviously, we met while we were at Yahoo, but I remember you were part of Loki. And did your co-founders also join Yahoo, or did they go their different paths?
No, the whole team joined Yahoo. And so one of my co-founders was also an APM, Brian Lobb, and then the others joined as one engineering team to help support Yahoo Fantasy Sports.
Nice, very nice. And you had 2 years at Apple, you said, right? So
Yeah.
what you said you're working on what exactly? Or is it confidential when you work at Apple and you're not allowed to talk about any of it?
I think I can talk about it in broad strokes now. So I worked with the Siri search team. So some of the machine learning projects that powered the brains behind Siri.
Okay. And what was the main motivation or driver for you to found Datasaur? I guess what you're working on now. Like, was there some sort of aha moment? Was it just the progression of knowledge or things that you picked up along the way? Like, do you just see like a huge opportunity? Maybe just get into that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I worked in various companies supporting machine learning, and one of my responsibilities as a product manager was to get the training data required for these models. So my engineers didn't have the time to gather the training data themselves, so it fell on me. Now, when I was at Apple, I spent hundreds of millions of their dollars gathering this training data. And, it was a large project and it was very time taking and very frustrating. There were times where I was still dabbling in spreadsheets. And I realized I could build the internal tooling for this for the third time in my career, or I could solve it for the broader industry once and for all. So I actually almost begrudgingly started Datasaur. I've always been a consumer PM. This would be my first kind of adventure in B2B. And I really didn't like the idea of sales at the time. I just wanted to continue being a consumer PM. But it was very clear to me that machine learning was here to stay. It's a very powerful technology, and that these models are very much powered and differentiated by the core training data. And if I could build a platform to gather this training data, that would be useful for not only all the current companies at the time in 2019, but also all the companies to come that would be investing in machine learning moving forward.
Okay. Well, excuse my ignorance, but I guess one thing I'm really curious about here is that
Mhm.
you've got these large companies spending, as you said, hundreds of millions of dollars doing this data collection or doing this training, I should say. And so, why haven't companies tried to solve this problem in house? Or they have, but it's
Oh,
not to the extent that that one would like. Or
yeah, so that's exactly the trend and the pattern that I wanted to solve for, right? A lot of companies were inventing the similar looking tools internally. Everybody was reinventing the wheel, right? So think about a world for designers where Photoshop and Figma don't exist, right? And everyone's just creating their own design tool for their own designers. That's basically where we're at with data labeling. So many of these companies have started with spreadsheets and then started building their own basic web apps for this. And nobody's taking it to the extent that I knew we could take it with Datasaur. And so I wanted to solve this for the broader industry, make sure nobody would ever have to reinvent this again. And so that's the mission we've been on for the last 4.5 years.
okay, understood. And tell me a little bit about what it was like to start the company. I mean, obviously you've it's not your first rodeo. You've done a game startup before, but this feels like something that's in a totally different domain. So, how does this thing go from an idea that you had, or maybe solving your own problem while at Apple, to actually venturing out and doing it? Just for folks who may have never done a startup, what is it like? What is that whole process like?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is a large topic, but maybe just to kind of benchmark it, we are now a 55-person startup, right? We've raised $8 million to date. We're 55 people now. When we were starting out, it was a simple idea. I was a I was a sole founder. I had no co-founders this time around, but I had a team of 5 engineers ready to go. That was kind of the head start that I got in this with Datasaur. And so I knew exactly what I wanted to build. I designed it myself, and then I just had the engineers build it out, the MVP, right? So I think the journey for a startup for many feels very intimidating, right? A lot of the people I speak with, maybe they've been working at companies like Google or Meta, and they've had all these resources surrounding them. Um, it might feel intimidating to start a new company, but the process is actually very similar, right? You have an idea, you create a PRD, you create the design, you hand it off to the engineers, and then you implement it. I think the key thing here is you have to just take it one step at a time. You have to start with the designs, show them to potential customers. Hey, is this something that would be useful for you? Validate your hypothesis every single step along the way, right? Launch the MVP. Again, validate. Hey, is this something that you would you and your team could use. Is this something you and your team would pay for, right? There's this rule in B2B sales. If you can get somebody to pay even $1 for it, that's a huge turning point. Just getting someone to actually open their wallet, because you'll get a lot of people who want to support you and say, yeah, that's amazing. I would
You
totally
mean
use it.
from free to paid, essentially, right?
Exactly. That pivotal moment from free to paid is a huge validation moment, right? So as long as they open their wallet, now you know, okay, this is something that people actually want enough to pay for. And then you continue building from there.
And what was the journey like? Were you doing this kind of uh MVP part time while you were doing something full time? Like, did you just like how did I guess I'm this is getting to the nitty gritty, but how do you because you're saying right now you have 55 employees and
Yeah.
you've raised 8 million, but how like what are the stages, right? Because you said just building something, validating it, and then how do you get that initial round of funding, and how did you go through that whole thing? If you're willing to talk about maybe some of the
Yeah, of
the
course.
details. Yeah.
So entrepreneurs will approach this very differently depending on their life stage, depending on their personal circumstances, right? So there's no right way to go about this. But for me, I was fortunate in the sense that I was a second time founder. I had already built out a network here in Silicon Valley. So I had investors, pre seed investors is what it was called, right? Who were willing to bet on me and my vision. So I presented, people talk about a founder and a slide deck. So I just presented this 12 slide presentation, and I said, hey, this is what I'm going after. Will you help me fund the first few iterations of this product? And with that, we were able to secure $1 million dollars to pay salaries for myself and those 5 engineers, right? So, really, starting out, I had quit my job. And again, many people will do this as a side gig and ideate in their own time. But for me, I had already quit. I had taken some time off and I was brainstorming between various ideas I wanted to pursue. Datasaur was just one of them. And as I was having these conversations with potential customers, with friends, acquaintances, coworkers, I realized that this was something that there was a large enough audience of people who needed. And so that gave me the conviction to hire those 5 engineers to raise that pre-seed round and pursue this, right?
And how does it go after that? I mean, just you get that you get that's that you get that initial investment, and then how does it progress?
There are many different challenges looking back. I've been doing this for 4.5 years. I ran that first startup for 2 years. There are many different challenges for different stages of the company. But looking back, those were some of the most interesting times, right? I was literally just going out there and buying lunch and coffee for people in my network, asking if they could spare half an hour of time. And then it proceeds from there to, oh, we have a pilot MVP version. Would you be willing to test this for free? Right. And so you're asking favors. And I'm grateful to everyone who took their time to sit down with me and give us feedback. But you take the feedback, you start um, looking to parse out what are the common threads, what are people repeatedly coming back to, right? What are the themes that people say, oh, this looks pretty good, but I really need this before I could deploy it at my office, right? And that could be anything from like, I need to be able to log in via Google, or I need this feature, right? Or I need to support audio files, not just text files. So you talk to 50, 100 people. In startup culture, this is called getting out of the building, walking out the door and like talking to people. This was pre-pandemic in 2019. So I was just driving up and down the bay, visiting people at their offices, talking to them in coffee shops, and using that to, again, build conviction in what's our next sprint's worth of work? What's the next 3 months worth of vision? Forget a 1 year product roadmap, right? Like we can't even think about 6 months down the road. So we would focus on 3 months at a time, 1 week sprints. We are now on 2 week sprints, but at the time we were doing weekly sprints. And I was the PM for it, taking immediate feedback from our customers, relaying that back to the engineers, and figuring out what we need to build next.
Right.
And then after, 3, 4 months of this, we got our first paying customer, right? They paid us $25 a month, which is nothing in the world of SaaS. But just getting them to pay us $25 a month was huge for us. And you get one customer, you get two customers, you get the 10 customers, and then we started going through accelerators, right? There's, again, in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of resources. So I went through the Stanford StartX Accelerator, which is entirely free of charge for Stanford alum. And they were really helpful in providing feedback and framework and in introducing us to more investors and more clients. And we used that to then apply to Y Combinator, and we got into YC. And we use those 3 months as like a pressure cooker. They really force you to hit certain milestones. And we use those milestones to then fundraise, right? And by the way, in all of this timeline, we went through YC from January to March of 2020. So our demo day
Mhm.
from YC was the day that California went into shutdown for the pandemic. So it's a chaotic, very interesting time. But we made it and we raised our seed round. And from there, we were off to the races.
Mhm. I mean, just to commentate a little bit on what you said, to me, it feels like there's so much benefit from, first of all, having the experience and being Ivan, like being who you are. I think having that background helps a lot just because of competencies and network. But I think the other point, which I think I just said already, which is like it seems like the network is just huge, right? It's just being part of a certain community or communities or being in the Bay Area just mattered so much, right? Like I would it be difficult? Would you say maybe it's the leading question, but it feels to me like it would be difficult to do it at another location. Is that fair to say?
I can objectively say it would be harder to do it in any other location. But that being said, we are now in this fully globalized world. Startup culture has spread and disseminated to many cities, right? So, for example, it wouldn't be that much more difficult to do this in New York or Seattle or LA because there are startup cultures there as well, right? Singapore in Asia would be another great startup hub. But even beyond that, let's say you're not, your personal circumstances are such that you don't live in one of these tech culture cities. All of the resources are online. I tell my PMs at Datasaur and all my engineers as well, the single most important trait to have in today's world is just curiosity, right? Because if you wanted to, you can watch almost every YC video on YouTube. You can read every blog post from the most famous VCs in the world. You can absorb 90% of the knowledge without being there. Does the network help? Absolutely. But if you are resourceful enough, you can join a local Discord community. You can join a remote community and just learn from other entrepreneurs in a similar journey. And when the time comes, you can slowly build out that network, right? I would just say a lot of that can be accelerated if you are here in person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think what you said about disinformation being so widely available is so true. I'm not even just thinking about startups, but just knowledge in general. I think the key is that people have to be willing, or one has to be willing to go and seek it, right? It's kind of like what I always like to say is that there's a billion books on a bookshelf. Like you could literally learn anything you wanted on YouTube or Google or anything today.
Yeah,
But do you want to? Like you have to be the one to actually take the book off the bookshelf and read it and apply
yeah,
it. Like and it seems like I don't know. Sometimes it feels to me like people are not willing to do that, or they feel like they need to get it from a specific bookshelf. Like I can't get the knowledge from bookshelf A. I have to get it from B by going to this group. Like I don't know if you ever felt that or been around people who have that sort of behavior. Like it feels like there's a certain mindset that one has to be in to be ultimately resourceful, right, and be able to seek information wherever it exists.
absolutely. I would say in the last 5 years, one of the questions I'll sometimes ask in interviews is just, where do you learn from, right? And I think one of the most common and best answers is folks who can easily cite the YouTube channels or the podcasts that they listen to or the newsletters that they follow, right? But I think this is constantly evolving, right? Podcasts are a more recent thing. Now that we're in 2023, things like ChatGPT make it easier than ever, right? You can literally formulate the question however you want, and it will be able to search the entire internet trove of data and find answers for you. right? So now I really feel like there's no excuse for not being able to dive into whatever topic you want to learn more about, whether that is getting to an MVP or how to fundraise from investors or whatever kind of challenge you might be facing as an entrepreneur along your journey.
Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to be guided by Y Combinator? Because YC is so legendary, and obviously the folks who run YC are legendary as well.
Mhm.
And I've personally known quite a number of folks that went through it. And can you talk about how they shaped, like, was it everything that you expected going into it? Like, what kinds of guidance did they give or not give? And ultimately, like, just maybe just speak on that a little bit if you can.
I'll give my first controversial hot take on this podcast. I actually think that some of the stories are, you know, they happen, but they won't happen for everyone. So, for example, one of the more famous stories is, a startup comes in with a terrible idea, and then they talk to one of the YC partners, and the partner points them in a different direction, and now they're a unicorn, right? I've heard multiple times that that actually happens. But on the flip side, obviously, they won't be guiding all, the hundreds of startups all towards being unicorns, each and every batch. So I actually think you can get a lot of the YC knowledge from their online resources. For anyone listening to this, you can just Google YC Startup School, and it's an incredible knowledge base of resources. And you can get 90% of the YC mentality from that alone, right? What you really benefit from is one, that true to its name, the 3 month kind of accelerator is an accelerator, right? Being you're being forced to set certain ambitious KPIs and do everything you can in your power during those 3 months to hit those KPIs, right? Um, the other is the lifelong network. Once you're a YC founder, you have access to the community for life. And so you can always reach out to other YC founders. There's a lot of successful people there. You can hire from the community. I made lifelong friends from the network. So I think those are actually more of the kind of intangible benefits. And then the last thing, this one's debatable depending on your own personal background, but the ease with which you can fundraise at the end of it, right? So I think people have to come into it knowing what they want to get out of it. If you think that it's going to just magically make your startup successful, I think that is not at all true. But if you want to be surrounded by other hardworking, ambitious, creative people for 3 months, be pushed to your limits, and just help yourself succeed, I think that is probably closer to, what it really offers.
Understood. Yeah, I think there's definitely some nuance there. It's a combination of being self-driven to begin with, and then getting a little bit of a boost. But it's basically too much of a hot take to say that YC alone helps you or doesn't help you, right? Like it's got to be a combination of the resources that you choose to leverage, and obviously you mentioned also a little bit of like a unicorn survivorship bias, or maybe like picking certain data points and saying like, yeah, there was one company that did that, and that doesn't obviously extrapolate to all companies going through it. So
That's right.
yeah. Um, Tell me a little bit about how you scale your company. Like just now you have PMs, you mentioned that. Now you have 55 people. In the beginning there were 6. Like how did you make those kind of decisions to grow the company? I guess just speaking from personal experience, I found that to be very hard when I was uh running my own startup, but I love to hear from you how you managed to figure out those points along the way.
That's interesting. Not to diminish your experience, but for me, it almost felt that was actually one of the easier things for us to kind of figure out because when we needed someone, we knew we needed them, right? Like,
Hire for need, right? Yeah.
yeah, it was like it's like when you're starving, right? So, for example, I mentioned we started with 5 engineers and myself, and I knew my next hire had to be a designer, right?
Hmm.
Because none of us could design the product in a way that would be acceptable for by professional standards. I can do a wireframe and an MVP and it's going to look, okay. But for this to be a professionally polished product, we needed a full-time designer. So our next hire had to be a designer. And it kind of felt that way along as we grew, right? If I think about it in kind of like this amorphous blob that's um, growing, and sometimes you grow like, oh, I have too many engineers. Now I need another PM to kind of help shepherd the engineers because our existing PM is overwhelmed, right? Or now we've got, uh, enough front end work, but we've got a bunch of back end work as we're trying to scale this out. We definitely need to hire two more back end engineers. So I feel like the company told me at any given point or told our managers, look, we're really, really hurting for this position and we need to open this up and hire in the next 2 months. The danger is sometimes in not knowing what you need. So, for example, I've met many startups who are in desperate need of a designer, but they don't value the design function enough to know that they need to hire someone there, right?
Mm.
Or in our case, I probably could have hired a salesperson earlier on instead of doing it all myself. There's absolutely value in founder-led sales and me needing to learn how to do it myself, but it also could have been valuable for me to hire a salesperson that I could also learn from in parallel during the earlier days because I made a lot of mistakes on the sales side, right? Or when is the right time to hire your first marketing person, right? These are things where unless you've done it before, it can be harder to identify, hey, we actually really need somebody in this position. So yeah, you need to kind of have an appreciation for the different functions in order to realize there is a need there.
So what exactly is your framework for having that kind of awareness? Is it just having done it before? Is it like having like what is it exactly that tells you
Yeah.
I need a salesperson now as opposed to doing it myself?
Yeah, I think that part is a little bit harder. Sometimes you just have to learn as you go along. In my case, there are times where, for example, I work with a sales coach, right? Which I highly recommend to founders who've never done sales before. So working with the sales coach, like by the time I hired a sales coach, they pointed out it's probably time now to hire an AE. So listening to experienced veterans who can tell you when it's the right time to hire a certain function. The
Hmm.
other thing that I really like is working with kind of like a part-time function for something. So like a part-time marketing person, a part-time finance person, using that to kind of, instead of going from zero to one person in a department, going from zero to fractional CXO, and then hiring that person eventually when the part-time work is overwhelming.
You mean having somebody like a contractor or someone part-time?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, for example, we had a part-time contractor for SEO and SEM in the early days. And then when, we were a large enough company and it was the right time, it was easier to say, okay, now we need to hire, the next level marketing firm.
Hmm.
Um, Same thing with, yeah, I think the same can go for, working with a contracting designer for some of your early work before realizing, okay, we need somebody here full time. There's just too much to continue, and it's too expensive to keep paying a contractor.
How do you know when someone's not right for the role? I'm sure you've had to stop working with folks, right?
Yeah, that is challenging. I think
Arguably harder than hiring, perhaps.
absolutely. I think the flip side of what I said earlier is this is where it is important for me as a CEO to spend some time in a function to better understand what makes for a good person in that role. So, for example, in my first startup, I didn't know how to hire designers and artists because it was a video game. We needed a lot of art assets. I didn't know how to interview designers and artists to begin with, right? So it took a long time, but I actually picked up Photoshop myself, started designing some screens myself, and got myself a little bit more familiar with the role. And once you've done something for a little bit, it becomes that much easier to say, okay, this person is clearly 10x better than I am at this role. One of my mentors actually told me that when he's a founder and CEO, he takes on a role to fire himself from that role and hire somebody who's objectively better at that role, right? So one of the tricks can just be do it yourself, do sales yourself, and then when you don't have the bandwidth for it anymore and you need an expert, hire someone better. Do marketing yourself. When you need help, then hire an expert marketer.
And how do you know when that person is not living up to expectations? Is it because things come back to you or
Mm. This actually, I just approach as any product manager would. It comes down to KPIs, right? Objective metrics. Here are, you set clear expectations. Here's what I expect from this role. If you can meet these by the end of the year, then we're all good. If not, then you start putting them in a performance improvement plan and phasing them out.
Got it. That, yeah, just manage for performance, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Um, what's the mix like? Are you hiring a combination of more senior folks, and I mean in terms of experience versus folks straight out of college? Like how's the split like? And is it different based on the functions too?
Yeah, certainly. It definitely has to do with your financial situation and what you can afford, but it also you do need to have a mix, right? So you need to have some new grads who are eager to learn and ready to jump in and do some of the simpler tasks, and you also need some veterans to guide them along the way. So identifying that mix, let's say this is common in startups, right? Maybe you can't afford a super seasoned CTO yet, then either look for an advisor and just give them shares to advise and review the architecture of your work, or there are some investors who have CTOs in their network, and that's one of the value add services that they have is um, giving access to certain CTOs who can review and make sure that you're on the right track.
Right. I also want to ask you about how you balance your time, right, as the CEO. Particularly, I'm interested because I was doing my own startup, but also like you, I've been a product manager for many years. And you mentioned hiring product managers, and it's always interesting to me how that works, like between the founder or the CEO and the PMs on the team. Effectively, you're delegating some of the product or the vision to PMs. So how do you balance that? Are you still in the weeds a lot? Are you more hands off? Like how do you approach that with PMs?
Yeah, there's definitely a caveat here. And I'd heard stories already that product CEOs have a really hard time letting go of product, right? So that's something that every founder should be aware of. When you've been shepherding the product vision from the company's founding, from its birth, it can be very hard to let go. So I had to be very selective in choosing my first PM. I had to set up a transition period, right? And I think in that case, it was 6 months actually. Like we had to work hand in hand, make sure that they understood how I operated, what my vision was before I could hand it off. One thing we haven't mentioned yet so far is 90% of my team is actually in Indonesia. So we're a 55-person company. I'm here in the US along with the sales, marketing, and customer success functions. And then all of the product design and engineering team is in Indonesia. So now there's even a bigger gap in the sense that we only have limited overlapping hours, right? But we had to carefully design for a transition and make sure we got to the point where they had full autonomy and responsibility. I can give guidance, I can give feedback, but it's no longer something that I personally own, and I have to learn to let go, right?
Learning to let go, was that something you've been doing even before Datasaur? Like how do you develop that
Yeah.
kind of mindset or skill?
No, to be honest, this was the first time in my career I really had to do it. I was really forced to do it. But what you have to, it comes back to your original question, which is how do you spend your time and how do you allocate your time? And I reflect on this every 6 months at the very least, because our performance reviews are every 6 months, and I do a self review. And what I try to do every period of time is reflect on what I need to spend time on, where I need to spend my time, right? So, yes, even now, even after we have a team of 4 product managers, I probably still spend 15-20% of my time on product. It never fully goes away. But I know the majority of my time needs to be focused on go to market, marketing and sales, right? So, I think Q1 of this year was sales, Q2 was marketing, Q3, I was actually focusing more on PR and kind of outreach. So I have a theme for every quarter or every 6 months. And in order to really focus on that theme, I also had to say, okay, I need to let go of product and just trust that they've got it under control.
Are there times where it's been difficult or something has happened where you feel like you needed to reestablish yourself in the center of it or to be more hands-on?
Not so much where I had to reestablish, but there will be times where I give heavier amounts of feedback than other times, right? So, for example, for a while we were just churning out new features because our customers were requesting, demanding them. And then in at the end of last year, beginning of this year, I told the product team, hey, we need to slow down our feature release and actually focus on polish because we've scaled a little too quickly and now we're finding too many little issues where things are going wrong and edge cases we haven't really seen before. So let's slow it down, take a breather, reduce the number of features by 30% so we can spend time on polish, right? So I'll give guidance like that at a high level. But then it's up to them now to interpret and incorporate it into their roadmaps.
Right, right. There's almost like very overly simplistic statements in startup culture about what you should and shouldn't do. I felt like, especially before COVID, having gone through it myself, there was a lot of just adages like or statements that you can't be successful with a remote team, or everyone has to be together, or you have to do A and not B.
Yeah.
Like I'm curious if you can speak to maybe some of the the common wisdom that you've actually broken or kind of reinterpreted in different ways. And I know it's a pretty open-ended question, but there's probably a million examples. But I'm just curious about it.
Yeah. Well, I feel like nothing's ever black and white, and there are many different cultures that work at many different startups, right? So I think a lot of people, when coming up with these adages, it's based on their own experience, and I understand that, right? But it really depends on circumstance. So, for example, we started in 2019, pre-pandemic, but we've been remote from the start. And I've had VCs question that, and accelerators pass on us because they're like, "Look, we've seen this before. Remote teams never work out. You're just that much more productive in person, right?" And that debate continues even now. But we were ahead of our time. I guess fortunately, we didn't have to kind of regroup or do anything terribly differently for the last 3 years. And we've built and designed for a remote first culture and experience, right? So we're native on Slack and Zoom. We have all of our documentation in place. We have specific weekly meetings where I do interface closely with the team. Um, but I also know how to the culture actually has to be stronger than ever in a remote environment because engineering leads and PMs have to make dozens of decisions every day, every week with while I'm sleeping, right? So they have to know how to channel um, how I would handle things if I was there. And so it actually empowers a lot of our leaders at the company to make decisions that, maybe in a physical office, they would come running to find their manager and be like, how do I handle this? But now everyone has that autonomy. So this is working for us, but I'll also be the first to admit I miss being in a physical environment and seeing my colleagues every day and getting lunch with them. And there are elements that are beneficial to that, right? So yeah, there's no black and white. Different things can work for different companies and different cultures, but we found something that works for us.
Can you also speak to being a solo founder? Because there's also a common adage that you can't do it alone, right? You need mutual motivation or work spouses or something like
Yeah.
co-founders to do it. And obviously, you've done it for Loki and other environments. But what is it like now, and how are you? Maybe the question is also from a motivational standpoint, like how does one get things done when you're a solo founder?
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't recommend solo founding to anyone. Loki, I had four co-founders, so this is my first time solo founding a company. The only reason that I decided to solo found this is because I was fortunate enough to have five engineers. Like that's just a very lucky head start um, that most people don't have access to. And between myself as PM and pseudo designer and a mixture of front end and back end engineers, we had all the skill sets required to build the MVP. And I think that is critical. The other thing I would call out here is yes, you absolutely need people you can rely on, talk to, go to for, the hardest decisions you have to make at startups. I am fortunate enough to have a network of advisors. In addition to a sales coach, I have a CEO coach. I have close friends and family that I can talk to about these very difficult decisions. So if I have a personnel issue, I can talk to someone. If I have a business issue, there's someone else that I can go and talk to. So I felt my network was strong enough, right? But this is very much the exception to the rule. I think, generally speaking, teams of two and three have a much better shot at success.
Were there times that you had considered adding co-founders or
Oh, yeah,
maybe changing the mix a little bit?
absolutely. It was just the people I would have wanted to co-found with at the time were not available, right?
They were occupied.
Yeah. So
Okay.
there are absolutely people that I would work with in a heartbeat, right? But it just depends on stages of life and all that.
hmm hmm Speaking to the bigger motivational question, I guess this show is called The Why. So, like, what is the thing that really drives you to do what you're doing? Doing something that is incredibly difficult, time consuming, working with folks in Indonesia,
Yeah.
worrying about things day and night. Like, what is the underlying thing? Is it are you trying to? Yeah, I guess it's just the question. Like, what is really driving you?
So this one actually gets personal. What drives me personally right now is when I was at Stanford, I was surrounded by people who were just the best at what they did. They'd be on the national soccer team, or the youngest person to climb Everest, or published authors in their domain, or whatever, right? I've never been top 10 in anything that I do. I, I think I'm above average at many of my hobbies and interests, but I've never been at that level. And it's too late in my life to go and be a top tier athlete at anything.
Yeah,
But
perhaps.
um, so I thought about what I wanted to kind of establish that at. And maybe one thing I could be good at is product management. But as you know, there is no trophy for the best product manager. There's no legitimate prize for being a top 10 or top 100 PM, right? There's no measure of that. And so, how can I assess that I'm actually a good PM? Um, I think the only way to measure that is by building a profitable product. So my aim with Datasaur, and the reason I started this company was to assess, like, I looked at a number of different ideas. I said, which one is most likely to succeed in being $100 million business? If I exceed that, then great, right? But like for me, if I can build $100 million business, I will have proven to myself that I'm a successful PM. So that's really it. Um, the other thing, of course, is just the fact that um, to a certain extent, I felt like I had plateaued in terms of my learnings at larger corporations. I knew how to do product management, going through the strokes, executing. You can have larger projects, you can have do different things, but it felt redundant. And in my reflecting back on my career, the highest trajectory of personal growth and learning was when I was at my first startup. And I realized I wanted to do that again. As difficult as it is, as stressful and sleep depriving as it is also the most rewarding at the end of it. So, yeah, I can definitely say that about my period here at Datasaur as well. I have learned so much in the last 4.5 years, and I'm eternally grateful for the opportunity from my investors and from our customers to be able to learn how to do this, right? To scale up. I've never managed a team of 55 people before. So I think, yeah, those two things proving to myself that I am a good product manager and pursuit of learning and growth.
hmm So kind of unpacking that a little bit, you strike me as a very results oriented person, or like someone who's very intentional with how he wants to develop as a as a person, really, not just in terms of career. Like, where does that come from? Like, what even got you into Stanford in the first place? It's not everybody that says I want to get into Stanford just gets in there, right? Like, this is this kind of work ethic? Did it just come at a young age, or what was it?
Surprisingly, nobody's ever asked me that before. Um, I'm not sure I have a good answer for that one. I'm sure a lot of it has to do with the way I was raised. Um, I also have an interesting mix of competitive and team spirit. So, on the one hand, I am quite competitive myself, and I want strive to be the best at whatever it is I'm doing. But on the other hand, I also participated in a lot of team sports. And I really enjoyed that sense of camaraderie and working together with others. So um, that doesn't really answer how I got into Stanford. That was more just a bunch of studying.
I mean, like,
Yep.
did you? What kind of family background did you grow up in? Like, did your parents give you certain values? Was it like nurture? Like, what?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. Um, my parents definitely had a lot of influence here. I think, uh, yeah, they both heavily emphasized um, schoolwork to a large extent. Like, the only way I could get out of chores was if, I had a test or a big project due the next day and they would rather me do homework than chores, right? Um, so I think I was pushed to excel academically. I also, in my extracurriculars, I think developed a similar drive for success. So, for example, I competed on the high school chess team. I competed on the ultimate frisbee team, um, and my desire to do well in school, my competitiveness to do well in school, translated for myself to also push myself to be better at my sports and activities. Right. So I think all of that together just culminated in somebody who always strived, who believed that I could get to, the 4.0, getting into the Ivy League school or the equivalent. Um, Maybe the confidence to do a startup, right? I think all of these are just like, well, if you work hard enough, you can achieve anything you need to.
Mm. I don't mean for this to come off as a kind of negative thing, but I do feel like sometimes ego or legacy drives us in ways that can actually be productive, right? Because you mentioned that there's a little bit of, maybe you were much younger back then, so maybe you feel differently now, but like when you're at Stanford, you're benchmarking yourself against people who are top 10 in some other field.
Yeah,
And the comparisons never stop, right? Like once you become top 10 in something, you'll find someone else. There's another entrepreneur, there's another product manager that's there's a higher mountain to climb basically, right?
yeah.
But I think how do you how do you channel that in a healthy way? Have you found yourself being able to do that, or to handle that mentally in a healthy way, I should say?
That's a good question. I think a lot of that, if you recall my motivation to build $100 million business, it's not comparing myself to another entrepreneur.
That's true. Yeah, it's reformulated to be now. It's maybe the cliche thing is like you're comparing yourself to yourself, right? Like, can I do this, right? It's not like someone else has done it. Can I do that, right?
That's right. Um, that's right. So I think setting your own internal benchmarks, but that not having to be everything, right? Realistically, I would have liked Loki to be much more successful than it was. Um, but I got a lot out of those 2 years. I learned a ton, and I was, fortunate enough to return all my money to my investors and get a good outcome for my team. So, you know, I would have liked to build my $100 million business with my first startup, but I also didn't really I don't beat myself up for not having achieved that. It's just what did I learn and what can I do better the next time around? Every single job that I took, I reflected, put down my list of like, what am I what am I optimizing for in my next role? Why am I taking this? And then reflecting every 6 months, 12 months to see if that is actually happening, right? So for example, when I had offers to go to either Google or Apple, um, and one of the things that I realized was I'd been at a number of companies, but I felt like the products that I worked on were never home runs, right? Um, I had never felt like I built a product and experienced that like exponential growth, whether it is by revenue or by number of users or just kind of industry acclaim. I'd never really experienced that. So my thinking in going to Apple was, hey, this is the most successful company of all time. I love their products. Maybe there's a lot for me to learn from working on a successful product. What does a successful organization look like, right? And once I kind of joined and absorbed and understood what that looks like, okay, am I satisfied? Not quite, right? Like what am I missing? Like what did I get wrong in my hypothesis? And it's the fact that PMing and kind of the day-to-day requirements of that were no longer challenging to me, and I needed a challenge. And so then I reflected, thought about what I wanted to do next, and settled on Datasaur. So I think part of it is just, at every single stage of my career in between jobs, uh, deciding what is important to me in that moment. What do I want to do? What do I want to get out of my next role?
If you look into the future and Datasaur gets to 100 million,
Hmm.
what happens? Like what would your obviously you haven't gone there yet, so maybe it's not you don't even have the luxury to think about it. But have you thought about it? Like what happens after that?
Haven't. Everything's focused right now on getting there first, and there are intermediate milestones on the way there, right? So for example, we've achieved 1 million in revenue. How do I get to 5 million? How do I get to 10 million, 20 million, 50, 100, right? So there are still steps on the ladder, even getting there. Once I'm there, I'll figure it out. I'll have a lot of time to reflect, and figure out what's next, and I'm sure I'll have a very different perspective and vantage point at that time anyway.
Switching gears a little bit, can we talk a bit about large language models or LLM? I have to admit I'm very much an outsider here, but
Yeah.
you seem to be someone who's lived in this world for quite a while. Obviously, there's certain external trends right now in the industry that are hot, but I mean, you've been involved with this for a very long time. So, can you tell me a bit more about LLM, maybe how this fits into Datasaur?
Yeah. So
It's a
for
two-part question. So, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe I'll set some context here. So Datasaur is a data labeling and training data platform, right? And we specifically focus on the sub branch of machine learning that is natural language processing, NLP. So from day one, Datasaur has been focused on NLP, which involves text, audio, and documents. Obviously, generative AI is very hot these days. There have been a couple of really big technology leaps that have occurred in the last year and a half. The first was Dolly, and the second was ChatGPT. And I think that's what sparked this generative AI um, revolution. Now, the ChatGPT side of things, the large language model side of things, that is a natural extension of everything that we've been doing because it is all about text and language. So this technology shift is something I'm incredibly excited about. I think um, I haven't felt this much excitement about a new product since the advent of the iPhone in my lifetime, right? And a close friend and I were discussing whether this is closer to the birth of the iPhone or the birth of the internet itself. So, regardless of where we land on that spectrum, the fact that it's on that spectrum is pretty remarkable. So, I'm, at the end of the day, language is the fabric of our society. as a human race. It's how you and I are communicating right now. It's how we've learned to document things on pen and paper and digital databases for millennia, right? And so being able to teach a machine to understand how we communicate, there it's just, as a product manager, it's just super exciting to think about what changes that will bring to our day-to-day lives moving forward.
How is it going to bring changes to our everyday lives moving forward, in your opinion?
So I think that it will just, because machines can now understand these historical archives, we're going to be able to accomplish so much more, right? We will be able to query in a very natural way um, all of the documents that have come before us, right? So, for example, one of the holy grails of this new revolution is building Jarvis from Iron Man, right? And personal assistants have been chasing this for years, ever since Apple purchased Siri. Um, the idea that you can just ask this personal assistant about anything from the weather to what's on your calendar to, how should I plan a proposal, right, to this, to someone in your life. Being able to do all of these things in a personalized manner that is relevant to you based on everything you've experienced in life, I think that has, Apple, Google, and Amazon have all tried to do this and largely failed, right? Alexa had so much invested into this, and they actually laid off a majority of their team earlier this year. Um, Siri and Google Assistant are more so the butt end of jokes rather than like a daily habit for most users.
Mm-hmm.
So this new technology is actually going to make that possible. And I think we're going to see a new revolution in those technologies. On the flip side, for business, right, we saw um, people keep questioning whether this technology is going to make entire job functions obsolete. But recall that people said the same thing about spreadsheets and accountants, right? They thought spreadsheets would make accountants obsolete. Here, 40 years later, we still absolutely have accountants. They're just very proficient with spreadsheets, right? So similarly, financial analysts, lawyers, paralegals, a lot of the kind of office work that we've taken for granted as very stable jobs, they will be transformed, right?
Mm-hmm.
They won't be replaced entirely, but people will have to learn how to use this new technology to make them more efficient at what they already do,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this stuff that I'm kind of talking about goes beyond just product vision for the next year or two, what the next smartphone is going to enable. But this really starts looking into like futurism type stuff, right? We see like 20 years of technology advancement packed into the next 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's also become an existential thing for larger companies like Google and Meta,
Yeah.
where I think just by how they're responding or how they're hiring and firing their workforce, I think there's definitely a, maybe reckoning is too strong a word, but like it's definitely a sea change in like how the entire industry is being shaken up. And so I would equate it more to maybe the the founding of the internet. For me personally, it feels more like that than the iPhone because it is that. So
Yeah, it can upend every industry. Yes, starting with the technology industry and, our usual leaders of FANG could be, a new set of letters by the end of the decade. But it can also completely transform the leaders in, you know, industries from real estate to agriculture to finance. If someone, think about the Bloomberg terminal, right? If someone's able to create a better version of that that is LLM native, that can be an existential threat to a historic company like Bloomberg themselves. So I really think that everybody is sitting up and paying attention and figuring out how to adopt this.
Mhm. So what you're doing with NLP, it is very much a part of this. Uh, I don't know how to call it, like value chain, or it's very much a part of this this evolution, right?
Yeah, well, the way I would describe it, kind of in as at a high level here, is everybody starts with a foundation model. Examples of foundation models would be things like ChatGPT, or Claude, or Falcon or Llama 2, right? Like there's a lot of these large foundation models, and most people cannot afford to build one of these foundation models themselves. But what they will want to do is take one of these foundation models and customize it, either connect it to their own database, because the models only have access to the stuff that's publicly available on the internet. They don't have access to your company's internal records, right? So you want to customize it by connecting it to your own data sources. And then they'll want to fine tune it further to make sure that it handles your types of use cases and queries correctly. And fine tuning that data and using something called reinforcement learning via human feedback, that's the portion that Datasour can help with. It requires a lot of data, like new examples. Hey, if a lawyer asks you this question, this is how you should answer. If a real estate agent asks you this type of question, you should be querying this database, and this is the type of answer you should provide. That's where Datasour comes in, and you can generate a lot of this training data, customize it, and deploy it for your own internal use cases.
Got it. Got it. Wow. I mean, I mean, it sounds like you're onto something here. Then, I mean, obviously no one knows exactly what the future of tech will be, but it seems to be in the right direction. You seem to be part of this, for lack of a better term, ecosystem or way things are going.
I hope so, right? The best, if I could describe 2023 in one word for Datasaur and this industry, it would just be chaos, right? Everyone's trying to figure out what this technology means, how to adopt it, how to customize it, what's the best tech stack for doing so, what are best practices. But it's really exciting for us, with 4 years of historical expertise in NLP to be leading the way and saying, this is, these are ways that people are adopting it right now. These are some of the best practices we've seen. Here's an obstacle you may not have foreseen, but will help you circumvent that as you kind of figure out your own path and journey.
So we talked about 100 million, but what's the worst case scenario for your company? Like, what are ways that this could go wrong?
Yeah. Um, I think the biggest threat is that we don't figure out sales quickly enough, and we don't adapt quickly enough to the big sea change that is 2023, right? So I think one thing that I've had to learn the hard way is that the best product does not always win the market. Um, and one investor put it to me this way: in one decade earlier, Dropbox and Box were locked in this huge
Head to
battle.
head,
Yeah,
yeah.
right? This very public battle. And I think most people would agree at the time that Dropbox had a better product, but Box had the better go-to-market strategy. And they got all these enterprises to adopt them formally. And long term, we see Box doing significantly better than Dropbox and winning the majority of the market, right?
Mhm.
Despite the head start and brand name recognition that Dropbox had. And I think I understood that as a case study, but I think I've internalized that here, right? Having the best, most comprehensive product does not automatically win you everything. You need to um, do everything from learning how to properly sell the product. You have to understand a lot of kind of table stakes that I didn't know coming into this. Things like SOC 2 and HIPAA compliance and on-prem installations. You have to have thought leadership, brand name recognition. So you just have to go to conferences and just get people aware and like trust that your company's going to be around long enough for them to invest in it over the next 5 years. So there's a lot of these nuances that I've learned, but there's still a lot. I don't even know what I don't know yet, right? So I have to constantly be leaning on people who've been there, done that, and get guidance, even while we are in this brand new industry, brand new technology that no one has any experience with, right? So how do you adapt someone's learnings from the Dropbox box battle and adapt that to 2023 and, the different set of circumstances that surround an NLP labeling company? So I
Hmm.
think that's really what it's going to come down to. It's funny because we've got the engineering covered, we've got the design, the product side. I think all of that is covered, but it's this go to market strategy that we will need to figure out. And going from 0 to 1 is different from the go to market from 1 to 10. And from 10 million onwards, it's different from the next phase, right? So I have to be able to react and learn quickly enough as a CEO along the way.
What do you do to de-stress or to find balance? Because I think a big part of it is just anything we do. If you're working on something hard, which Datasaur is, like you have to take care of yourself. So like what are some things that help you manage the stress or the chaos?
Yeah. This is something that I actually learned the hard way a long time ago. So, my first startup, I actually burned out a couple of times. And when I say burnout, I mean like it was hard for me to get myself out of bed until noon. And this would last for like weeks at a time. So, I think uh, ever since then, I've put in place measures in my own personal life to ensure that I never reach that. It's things like having a strong support network of friends and family. Um, it can include going to like making sure that you see a therapist. It can also include just scheduling time to reset. For me, a couple of activities that really help. Ultimate Frisbee is really important for me. I just get out on the field, kind of forget everything, run around for an hour, and that's refreshing and invigorating. Playing video games is actually another one that works for me because when I'm playing a video game, like you mentioned, I stay up late in order to talk to my team in Asia. And then after everything, to make sure I'm not going to bed with like all the worries from work on my mind, I will play, if you're familiar with League of Legends, um, I
Yeah.
will play League of Legends because once I'm in that game, I can't I can't have anything else on my mind. So it's
Yeah, you have to
it clears,
focus on that.
yeah,
Yeah.
clears the
Hmm.
cache.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Ivan, thank you so much, man. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. This was a really pleasant conversation. I think there's some actionable things in here for myself and also for listeners. So thank you so much for taking the time. And I definitely want to wish you and your venture all the best going forward.
Thank you so much, James.
Thanks for listening to The Why with James Hsu. To support the show, please leave a rating on your favorite podcasting app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any platform really. It helps spread the word and tell others that you enjoy my work. Same goes for YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe and leave a comment. That helps get the word out and goes a long way. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.